Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Neil Malek, and this is Microsoft Visio. I would call this Visio 101 or an introduction to Microsoft Visio. The whole concept here is to get you guys enough skills so that if you had Visio on your home computer or your work PC, you can get in there, mess around with it a bit, and create a really professional organization chart, flow chart, those sorts of things. Before we get off the ground here, if you need to follow up with me after today's session, please feel free to use my email address, neil@knacktraining.com. And of course, that's my smiling face that you don't have to look at for the next half an hour. Today's session will be recorded and put up on YouTube afterwards, so please feel free to watch that over and over again, rewind, do those sorts of things if you'd like to see me repeat any steps from the session. And you can find that at youtube.com/neilmalek. In the same way, you can also go to that channel and find a variety of other videos about PowerPoint, Excel, things like that. As we move forward, my free webinars will all be posted on my YouTube channel, so you can watch those at your leisure. Now in today's session we're using AnyMeeting in order to have our conversation, and so over on the left hand side of the screen you'll see there's a chat bar. Please feel free to use that chat bar to ask me questions throughout today's session. In addition, if you have a microphone attached to your computer today, please feel free to speak up. You will be muted to begin with, but at the top of your screen you'll see a microphone icon, and by clicking that microphone icon you can unmute and ask the question verbally instead of using the chat feature. So our session today covers the following details. What is Microsoft Visio? Sort of why am I using it? What sorts of things can it build? Once we start to get accustomed to Visio itself and what we're going to try to accomplish within it, the types of diagrams we're going to try to build, for example, the three major components that you're going to be dealing with are what are called templates, stencils, and shapes. So a template is a file that we start off from that allows us to use a variety of different types of shapes that are included in these specific types of diagrams. And those shapes are organized into stencils. So if, for example, you're creating an organization chart, the organization chart is your template. It has a sheet of paper ready for a variety of different types of shapes that organization charts might need, and those shapes are organized into a stencil that you can use. If you decided that your organization chart would need additional shapes, you need to work with additional stencils. Once the shapes are on the piece of paper, then we need to be able to arrange them on the paper and also format them. Make sure that they use the right color, things like that. And then finally, as we get used to actually building with these things, then we need to back up and ask ourselves, what sorts of things are we going to need to use long term? And we can actually create our own templates and our own stencils to be used over and over again in these scenarios. So let me go ahead and jump right into Microsoft Visio and show you guys some things about the program. Before I do, could somebody use the chat box on my screen to let me know that the audio is coming through clearly? Are there any concerns, any technical difficulties to this point? Thanks, Debbie. Thanks, Rosemary. Excellent. Thanks, Peggy. Wonderful. So this is Visio 2010 that I have open here. As you can see on my screen, as soon as I open Microsoft Visio, it asks me the question, what type of diagram would you like to create? Up here along this top edge, you see that I have previously created flowcharts, organization charts, and office diagrams. But those are only three specific templates. If I were using a template that I hadn't used previously, I'd go to this list right here that included various different chunks of templates, and then be able to choose one of the individual templates from within there. So if, for example, I was trying to do something for business purposes, I'd probably just start off with this business category here. Click on the business category and I would see that there are a variety of different types of charts that I can start off from. I can start off from flowchart diagrams. I can start off with organization chart diagrams. create some sort of pie chart or something along those lines, cause and effect, brainstorming, all sorts of really good starting points. Now, if none of these were what I was looking for, I could then go back up to Home, click back and find, let's say, for example, one of the flowchart options, and I could choose a basic flowchart or a cross-functional flowchart, lots of different elements within the flowchart family. So the first thing we always do inside of Visio is we choose the template that is relevant to our work, and let's say we're going to start off with just a basic flowchart. Once we do that, over here on the far right-hand side, we choose what units the piece of paper is going to come in. And I think from my customer base, you guys are pretty much all in US units. And so you just hit the Create button over here on the side, and again, you've got this template that has the sheet of paper where you're going to put your diagram, and then ultimately, the different types of shapes that you want to add to the diagram are on the left-hand side. So Visio is perfect for building a variety of different types of diagrams that you need in business use, in home use, things like that, including not just things like flowcharts and organization charts, but things like layouts for your office or things like maps that you might want to build. All sorts of different visual things can be built using Microsoft Visio. All you need is a piece of paper and the shapes that you want to place onto that sheet of paper. So if, for example, in this situation I wanted to build a flowchart, you could see here that I could say at first we'll start off by starting the flowchart, and I'll just go ahead and drag my start end option right up here at the top and place that shape. And then as I move forward, after the beginning of my flowchart, I might need to perform the first process. I want you to notice that on my screen right now, an orange bar is showing up in the middle part of my shape. These are automated features called dynamic grid that show me exactly how these are lined up against one another, how far apart spaced they are, things like that. And so as I drop this, I know that the first shape and the second shape are aligned against one another. As I drag in a decision after my process, it allows me to line this up, and then as I pull it down, you can see those little orange arrows over on the far right-hand side that tell me how far apart these particular shapes are. And so this is building any type of diagram we have in mind. We go over to the left-hand side of the screen. This panel on the left-hand side of the screen is what we would call a stencil. So this is my basic flowchart shape stencil. If I click on the tab here for cross-functional flowchart shapes, I see that that's a different stencil. So these are my cross-functional flowchart shapes in a stencil. These are my basic flowchart shapes in a stencil. And I can pull any of these shapes out that I like. So if I needed to document the process, for example, I can grab a document shape and pull it out here to the right-hand side and drop it. Now, if there were other shapes that I needed that I did not see in my stencil to begin with, you could see that on the left-hand side there is a More Shapes option. And these are for bringing in other stencils. So for example, I might say, besides processes and decisions and things like that, I just want some general shapes like stars and circles and things like that that can contribute to this. Well, if I go over to More Shapes, you'll see that there are these different segments, like, for example, General. And in General, you see that there is a stencil called Basic Shapes. So if there were additional shapes I needed, I just need to know what the stencil was called that contained the shapes that were of interest to me. So I'm looking through here, I'm finding General and Basic Shapes, and as you can see now, besides the stencil for my basic flowchart shapes, besides the stencil for my cross-functional flowchart shapes, I also now have the stencil for my basic shapes. And that includes such oldies but goodies as circles and squares and rectangles. So I find a shape, once again, on the left-hand side that I like. I drag it in, and I place that shape in a location. And once again, that dynamic grid is there to help me out with spacing, with alignment, as I drag this element onto the page. And while you may choose to create any of a variety of different types of diagrams, this same procedure happens over and over and over again. Now, once you've started to work with these shapes, really where we need to go with this is, how do I now control these shapes in a variety of different ways? How do I control what they look like? How do I control how they're arranged? Things of that nature. So how they look is decided when you click on any shape. You'll see that at the top of the screen there are shape features for how is this thing filled in, what is the line color around the outside part of the shape, and does it have a drop shadow behind it. So if, for example, I go to the Start icon, click on it, I can then decide what color it's filled in with. I can then decide what line color goes around the outside edge. And in addition to that, if I go back to that line option, besides the color of that line, you also see that it has things like weight. So I can make the outside line really rather thick by choosing a bigger weight. And there you can see the look of my first shape has been changed significantly away from all of my other shapes. Okay, so we've started off by building a brand new diagram, by bringing in shapes of different kinds, and in fact, bringing in a brand new stencil, if that's relevant to us, and then bringing those shapes onto the page and formatting them to a small extent. Before I jump into the next idea, are there any other questions to this point in the process? Lovely. Okay. Now, of course, after we start to build these shapes, and after we decide to start painting them different colors and things like that, we're going to need to have a bit more ease of reuse. So by that, what I mean is, if I decide to go to one of these decision points, and I decide to fill it in a particular color and make the line a particular color and make the outside line a particular weight, I may need to be able to redo this over and over again. Now, of course, most everybody knows that you can copy and paste by using Control-C and Control-V. And Control-C and Control-V allow me to create a brand new second decision point directly next to the previous one. Now, besides Control-C and Control-V, there's another keyboard shortcut that simplifies that even more. It's Control-D. Control and the D key on the keyboard is duplicate within Visio. And so if there's any shape that you create that you need to do again, Control Duplicate or Control D is the fastest way to make that happen. So I click on any shape, I use Control D as in duplicate, it creates a second shape, and then Control D creates a third shape, and a fourth shape, and on down the line. As many as I like of that particular entry. So again, the keyboard shortcut here is Control-D to duplicate shapes. But duplicating shapes isn't quite enough because at this point I have way more decisions than I ever need to make through the course of my flowchart. But I haven't yet painted the other shapes in the same way as my decision. So what I'll do here is instead of duplicating the previous shape, I'll take the previous shape and I'll use it as sort of a template for the color of the other shapes that I'm going to work with. So I click on a shape that I like the look and feel of, and I use something called the Format Painter. On your Home tab at the top of the screen, up in the top left-hand corner, you'll see that besides copy and paste, there's also the option for Format Painting, which will allow you to take the color, take the outside line width and things like that off of a particular shape and reuse it on another one. Now if I go up and I click on the Format Painter once and then click on some other shape, it will then apply that color to the second shape. But as you can see by me clicking on other shapes, nothing happens when I click on any of the remaining shapes. So once again, I'll go ahead and make myself a few shapes here. And what I'll do is I'll start off by clicking on something that I like the look of. And instead of single-clicking the Format Painter, I'm going to double-click the Format Painter. Double-clicking the Format Painter will now lock in the fact that I'm painting off of that original shape and allow me to do it as many times as I like. I can now click on the circle and paint the circle, click on the rectangle and paint that, click on the rounded corner rectangle and paint that. So again, double-clicking the Format Painter allows me to format paint for essentially as long as I like. And at the end of that process, all I do is I hit Escape on my keyboard, and my format painting is done. So again, just to repeat here, you can easily decide to recreate the same circle over and over again with Control-D as in duplicate on your keyboard. But to make other shapes look like that circle, you would want to either single-click the Format Painter to do it once, or double-click the Format Painter to do it as many times as you like. If I double-click the Format Painter, I can now click on the star, and the hexagon, and the octagon up in the corner. And when I'm done, again, hit Escape on my keyboard, and I'm done with my format painting. So I'm able to bring in these shapes, format them however I like, and then repeat that idea over and over again throughout the diagram. And then, of course, the next thing that I need to be able to do is control the arrangement of these things on the page. Before I move into that, does anybody have any questions for me? Anything that is not immediately clear from those steps? Beautiful. Okay, when I first dragged in these shapes, you saw that as I was moving those shapes around, I had the dynamic grid show me where I was about to drop that. So these orange lines come in and tell me when things are properly aligned against one another, both horizontally and vertically. But doing this all by hand is sometimes not going to be adequate. For example, in my situation here, when I've got, let me actually just make a new page. All right, so I've got a page here, and I'm going to create a circle, and then I will make that circle look like whatever I want it to look like, different weight, etc. And then I'll duplicate this about 5 or 6 times. At this point in the process, if I wanted a strip of circles across this piece of paper, I'd need to start off by clicking and dragging the first one over here to the left, and then as I was working, I could drag each of the individual ones over and line them all up. But lining up 6 or 10 or 197 different shapes is really not what I'm getting into. So instead, what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to do the minimum amount of work possible and then allow Visio to pick up the slack. So I've now dragged my first circle up here into the left-hand corner. I'm going to drag my second circle over here to the right-hand corner. And that's enough, right? At this point, I can now turn to Visio and say, let's just go ahead and put the rest of the circles lined up between the first 2 circles. So let's see how that would work here. I'm going to click on the circle in the top left-hand corner, click on the second, hold down Shift and click on the second circle. And as you can see, it allows me to select the second one, and the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, and the sixth. And now I have all of these circles selected at the same time. At this point, under the Home tab at the top of the screen, there's an option that says Position. And under Position, I have 2 interesting selections. I have Alignment in this area, and I have Spacing in this area. So we'll start off with Alignment. We will tell all of these shapes to align themselves to the top edge by using the Align Top option. And then secondly, we'll make sure that there's an equal amount of space between those shapes. Let's give it a shot. Under the Position drop-down menu, choosing Align Top will align the top edges of every single one of those shapes. And then secondly, going to Position, going to Space Shapes, and telling it to distribute those horizontally across the piece of paper will create an even amount of space between each shape with almost no effort whatsoever. Isn't that nice? So again, just to repeat that idea, if I go in and I grab a rectangle and I make that rectangle look like whatever I want it to look like, and then I duplicate that with Control D a few times, all I've got to do is assign a position for the first shape and a position for the last shape. From there, Visio should be able to take care of the rest. So I can highlight all these shapes, choose the position drop-down menu, and align the bottom edges, and then use the position drop-down menu to create an even horizontal distribution of those shapes. How does that work for everybody? Anybody have any concerns there? Any questions? Now here's a really beautiful tool. If I go back up to the File menu, and I choose this time around to create a new organization chart instead. I started off with a basic flowchart because dropping normal shapes onto a piece of paper really doesn't have any other concerns built into it. But now if I have something like an organization chart that I'm going to build, now all of a sudden I have this idea of having a vertical hierarchy between these shapes. So I'm still going to start off with the same basic premise. On the left-hand side, I have a stencil full of shapes. I can drag any of those shapes onto the piece of paper I like, and then I can format them. But I'm going to add one more rule, and that is, okay, at the end of this process, I need to be able to create a diagram where I have a shape at the top, and then a set of shapes as subordinate shapes underneath that, and then a set of shapes underneath that. So how am I going to make this vertical hierarchy as simply as possible? Here's the beautiful thing. If you just go to the left-hand side of your screen and you grab that executive from the left-hand side of your screen, or manager is fine too if you don't want to grab executive, manager is the top of the food chain as well. And then just drag that executive right over here where we were originally going to place it. I want you to see exactly how easily this works out. So I'm going to grab executive from the left, drag it in, and immediately upon dropping it on the piece of paper, Visio is going to give me a little recommendation. A little pop-up's going to show up and say, okay, you've just dragged in the top of the tree. At this point, any other people that you drag in, as long as you drop them directly on top of whoever supervises them, you're going to be able to build out a tree that automatically has these connections. So let me give that a shot. I come over here to position, drag a position onto the executive and let go, and you can see that now there is a subordinate person to that executive. As I do it again, and again, and again, now I have 4 people who are subordinate to that executive. Now what would happen if I wanted to create somebody who is subordinate to one of the subordinates? I would drag a position onto the subordinate and let go, and now there are people who answer to that first subordinate. And now I drag positions onto another name, and there are people who answer to the first subordinate level. So every time that you go into Visio, you create a new org chart and you drag in things on top of previous employees. Now that previous employee is the supervisor of the new one. So I can come over here and say there's a new consultant that works under this person, and there's a new assistant for the executive. Now the problem, of course, is at some point you're going to start dragging in these shapes, and they're going to get a little too busy. And this is why I made a big deal over the difference between an organization chart and a flow chart. In the flow chart, you went in and said, line them all up against their top edges or their bottom edges, or line them all up against the center, and then use even spacing and things like that. But I want you to see exactly how easy this is in an organization chart. I'm going to click the executive at the top of the paper. And now at the top of my screen, I have a tab called Org Chart. And underneath Org Chart, you'll see that right down here, I have these layout options that allow me to evenly space those people. So let's say, for example, under that first executive, I want to use a horizontal arrangement where everybody is centered under the executive. It will now create a perfect stack of people that are centered under the executive and have the assistant kind of docked underneath that. Not only that, but now this person who has subordinates has a perfect structure underneath them as well. What would happen, though, if I wanted to go to this level here, to this person's subordinates, and I wanted to make the sort of vertical structure instead? What I would do is I'd go to that person's name, right? So this person who has subordinates, click on it and give them a vertical arrangement instead. And now there are people who are vertically arranged underneath this individual and people who are vertically arranged underneath that individual. So there's a horizontal structure underneath the executive, just like this. And then underneath those subordinates, there's a vertical structure. And so you have complete control over their stacking. There was a question that just came in. The question was, does select all or control A work? So it would, absolutely. The big thing for me, though, is that when you're working with an organization chart, you always want to tell it at what level you're deciding this organization. So as you can see, by clicking the topmost executive and then choosing, let's say, vertical side-by-side arrangement, it then tells all of the employees underneath that to use that vertical side-by-side arrangement. Or if I go to horizontal arrangement or what have you. Then by going to the subordinates underneath that, then I have the ability to go in and specifically choose how those people are arranged. And so it's a little bit smarter than selecting the entire chart, excuse me, because you're able to more clearly define which segment needs to be arranged in a particular way. At the end of this, all you have to do is go in and hit Relayout, and it'll just sort of clear all that out, and you can choose different sorts of organizations for that. Now, to tie all this up, we have this idea of stencils on the left-hand side of the screen. And to this point, I've been using, your basic flowchart shapes, I've been using cross-functional flowchart shapes, and then I brought in an additional stencil called basic shapes. Now, if I wanted to, let's say, conserve something like, let's say I went in and I said, there's a part of my organization structure where these people are actually a different segment of the company. And if they're a different segment of the company, they need to be colored a little bit differently. So here, the executive and everybody else with their sort of plain design is fine. But this person right here is a different segment of the company. So I'll go in and I'll fill in and create a line around the outside edge of that person. And I'll say, okay, perfect. In the future, I don't just want to be able to drag in standard positions that are in our standard part of our organization. I also want to be able to bring in positions for people who are in the additional segment, in that subordinate company, for example. In that situation, what I'd do is I'd go over here to More Shapes, and I'd actually tell it, you know what? I want to build a brand new stencil. I'm going to create a brand new stencil, and I'm going to put this new interesting shape I just designed into that stencil. So let's try that out. I'll go to More Shapes, go to New Stencil, and I will drag in that position shape that is colored like that. I'll save the stencil by clicking the little save icon and call this one, let's say, subordinate. Let's call this additional company shapes. And I'll right-click on Master 2 here and rename it and call this additional company employee. Okay. Now, all I have to do anytime that I have somebody who's part of that segment of the organization is drag that shape in and have them report to those folks. Let me go ahead and organize this again. All right, so I have employees underneath this person. And again, I organize that however I like. And you can see the benefit of creating that additional stencil, being able to bring in not just the color-coded ones for the first company, but also the additional company. Now, to tie this all up, we go in and save this as a template file, because what this allows us to do is create diagrams now that have the additional stencil always available to us. So by going to File, Save As, let me actually clear all this out. Okay, so I'm going to go to File, Save As, and I'm going to call this, let's say, Company Org Chart Template. And I'll save this not as a drawing, but rather as a template file, and hit Save. Now what I'm doing here is, as you can see, I've got this company org chart template that includes both org chart shapes and the additional company shapes. I'll close this off, and when I go back to my desktop, I see that there's that template sitting right there. By double-clicking the template, I can now create a new diagram, a new thing called Drawing 1, right up here at the top, that uses not only the organization chart shapes here on the left, not only the ability to put in positions that are part of the first company, but also an additional set of positions that are with the second company. So by creating a stencil, I can save those position shapes that I wanted, that I've customized. And by creating a template file, I'm able to save the whole thing as a package I can go back and reuse later on down the line. All right, I had a question come in. How do you show the positions that are on top of each other? Okay, that's all about being able to use the org chart area and the layout option here, Joanne. So if, for example, I decided to drag in some shapes and finally they ended up overlapping one another, like so, all I need to be able to do here, and again, you can see that they are in fact stacked on top of one another. I need to go to the top of the chart. I need to make sure that I can go in here and tell them to be, horizontally arranged or something along those lines. And if this is good for me, then great. And if it's not, maybe I'd go over here to this segment and lay that out vertically, and this segment and lay it out vertically. And so it's all about being able to control first the entirety of the diagram, and then once you've managed that part of things, go to each individual subordinate and restructure those along the way. That Control A that Teresa was asking about actually becomes important when I go in and I decide that this part of the diagram uses a vertical arrangement instead of horizontal arrangement. If I want to just go ahead and strip all of that out, Control A or Select All will grab the entirety of the diagram and allow me to say, you know what, the entire diagram needs to be side by side or something like that, and I can make that org chart into whatever is going to work for me successfully. Then again, once the whole thing is built out in this way, I can go to any individual subset and make them fit a little bit better with a different layout. Okay. Any other questions? Things that I can help you guys out with? Beautiful. So to put a bow on this, we have a tool in Microsoft Visio that allows us to create diagrams of a variety of different kinds. If that's something simple like a flow chart, you of course have shapes that you're going to want to bring in, position, and color code. If it's something more complicated like an organization chart or a timeline, then you'll want to understand that things like organization charts have these great features for organizing things, for being able to lay things out in particular ways, and that you have complete control over that. Then once you start to get good with building the drawing itself, you need to make sure that you can create stencils and templates moving forward. Your ability to create a stencil is under the More Shapes option, the ability to create a brand new stencil and drag in shapes that you've customized. And customization isn't just in the world of, building a pretty new shape that has a flare on it or something like that. It could be something as simple as the background color needs to be different. You can then save those into that new stencil, like I've done here on the left, and drag those out anytime you'd like to. Once all of that is done, to save the whole thing as a package, we choose File, Save As, and save not as a drawing file, which is our standard type of file for Visio drawings, but as a Visio template so that we can reuse that as much as we like. Lovely. Once again, everybody, feel free to check this out on YouTube later on this week. Thank you very much for your time and energy today. And remember, be amazing at what you do. Thanks, everybody.